Hi, welcome everybody. We'll just give everyone a moment to join. We've got a fantastic webinar tonight as part of the Urban Tree Festival. Do pop your name and location in the chat. It's always good whilst you're waiting to see where people are joining us from. We've got quite a group of people, so we'll just give everyone time to get in. I can see the clock at the bottom with the number of people is going up very rapidly. Welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. We're just letting everybody in. It'll just be a couple of minutes before we start. And as I said before, if you'd like to put your name and your location in the chat. We'd love to see where you're joining us from. We regularly have people from all over the UK. We've had Julia from Suffolk. Hi, Julia. Good to see you, or to see your name. And Claire's also in Suffolk. Lots of people from Suffolk. Claire from Chichester. Welcome those who are still coming in. We're just giving everybody time to join. Oh, Norfolk, Islington, North London, Wiltshire, Glasgow. Hi, Anne from Glasgow. Northwest Leicestershire, Mike. Welcome, everybody. And Eleanor, who's just moved to Gloucester from Ho Chi Minh City. Special welcome. We'll just give it 30 seconds more to allow people to come in, and then we'll start. Hi, Stephen, also in Islington, and Angelica in Finland. Welcome. Okay, here we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and welcome to this webinar, which celebrates the Urban Tree Festival. My name is Sarah Lolm, and I'm Chief Executive of the Tree Council, which is a national charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Urban Tree Festival, it's a celebration with more than 40 events, walks, talks, and even a writing competition. It's run by Paul Wood and Sarah Hayes and a passionate group of volunteers, and they're all working together for the love of trees. And we're very proud to be festival partners. But as you can see from the background behind me, the lovely bottom, the Tree Council is now well into the spring after a busy winter tree planting season. We work with nearly 700 schools and communities, and we planted an amazing 300,000 trees with them, including 25 kilometres of hedgerow. And one of the most extraordinary projects we partnered with was at Dulwich Picture Gallery in West London. And you'll hear more about that from Gallery Director Jennifer Scott very shortly. It was the most brilliant combination of nature and art, and it was brought together with support from Network Rail and National Highways. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our three fabulous panelists. Not only Jennifer Scott, we're also very honoured to have with us Emmeline Hallmark and Adam Curtis, who are going to share their knowledge and enthusiasm for art and nature and talk about their connections with the natural world. So I'm going to do some very brief introductions. First of all, Jennifer. I first met Jennifer at a special dinner hosted by Rob and Nick Carter when Dulwich Gallery was first planning how to transform their grounds. And I was instantly captivated by Jennifer's vision. It was extraordinary. Jennifer's had a very distinguished career. She was formerly director of the Holborn Museum in Bath, a curator of paintings at the Royal Collection Trust. She's worked as curator at the National Gallery in London and the National Museums in Liverpool. She's also authored and co-authored lots of publications. I have one of them here. I'd recommend this one, if you can see it. It's called Unlocking Paintings, which is available from Dulwich Gallery and all good bookshops, as they say. Then our second equally fabulous guest, Emmeline Hallmark, founder and curator of the Tree Art Gallery. For many years, Emmeline was a specialist in landscape art, particularly British landscape art of the 18th and 19th centuries at the Courtauld Institute. She worked for more than 20 years in the world of international art as head of the British Paintings and Drawings Department as a senior director at Sotheby's. And then nearly 4 years ago, in a completely new departure, Emmeline launched the only contemporary art gallery focused on trees in art. And the gallery is predominantly online and is unique because for every artwork sold, there's a donation made to tree planting or a conservation charity. So thank you, Emmeline. And finally, and very much not the least, the Tree Council's very own tree expert, Adam Curtis. Adam is Senior Officer for Community Planting Projects at the Tree Council. His knowledge and storytelling skills are legendary. He's not only an expert on trees, but also on bats, moths, mythology, deer, fungus, and much, much more. Adam and I worked together when Adam was Deputy Park Manager at Richmond Park in West London, which is a national nature reserve and a site of special scientific interest and home to more ancient oaks than the rest of Europe combined. Quick bit of housekeeping before we hear from our panelists. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, so that we can follow them easily, and we'll do our very best to answer as many as we can at the end. Now, I'm going to invite you to sit back comfortably. I'm going to hand over to Jennifer to share just a little bit about Dulwich Picture Gallery's fabulous new landscaping project and the role that trees play in the life of the gallery. And then Emmeline and Adam will follow on. We'll finish with some chat and questions. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so thrilled that you're hosting this event this evening, and it has been such a delight to work with you. I've been director at Dulwich Picture Gallery for 8 years, and hands down, my happiest day to date was the 26th of March, when in the meadow at the back of our gardens at Dulwich Picture Gallery, with an army of volunteers supported by the expertise of the Tree Council, we planted nearly 130 trees. And I think it's testament to you, Sarah, how much you help institutions to understand the outdoor world, and particularly the importance of trees. And I cannot thank you enough for the advice and the support you've given us. And Adam Curtis, who is going to be speaking also this evening, was just our rock in helping us to know how to approach such a project. So let me take this back a little ways and just explain what we're doing at Dulwich Picture Gallery. We are the world's first purpose-built public art gallery. There's a lot of words in that sentence, but basically we're the first art gallery that was built to be an art gallery. And luckily for us, in our beautiful corner of southeast London, which is only 15 minutes away on train from West Dulwich Station. You come from Victoria Station to West Dulwich, it's 15 minutes, and then it's a short, beautiful walk to the gallery. In that part of South London, we are lucky enough as an art gallery to be surrounded by 3 acres of green space, an art gallery set in a garden. And we have this dream to make the most of nature and to see how art and nature can be as one. And so in the next slide we'll show, you can see what our plans are. Now this is a bit difficult to read, but this is a plan that shows what we are currently up to. If you come to Dulwich Picture Gallery right now, you will see we have some hoardings up in the gardens, hiding some work that we are doing. And behind those hoardings, this plan is coming to life. Within this plan, you will see lots and lots of red circles. Those circles are trees, which we have been planting in what was an underutilized field at the back of the garden. And we are turning this into our sculpture garden. And it is a sculpture garden with a difference. There is a shape that you will see on this plan here that looks a bit like a croissant curving around. Well, this is a land earthwork that has been designed by the artist Kim Wilkie. And in fact, Kim Wilkie, he's a landscape architect, he has come up with the whole shape of this space. And the planting of trees was absolutely seminal for this. And this is why we needed the help of the Tree Council, and we needed the volunteers to come and help us to spend time planting new oak, elm and wild service trees in a specially created formation. The trees are about 10 years old already, and as they grow up, they will create what we are calling an art forest. We will create nature paths through the art forest, and sculptures will be able to nestle within them. And then back to this land earthwork, this form, which is impossible to photograph at the moment because it's a work in progress. So I just recommend everybody, even those of you who are visiting today on this call from Finland, you have to come to Dulwich Picture Gallery to experience this in all of its glory. We'll be launching it officially in September, but from July onwards, visitors will be able to come and experience this. It feels like a series of hills which carve out a shape in the land. But this isn't an arbitrary shape. This is part of our vision of how the outdoor space at Dulwich Picture Gallery can reflect the treasures that we have within inside the art gallery, because the form of this land earthwork takes inspiration from our most celebrated painting in the gallery. We'll see this now on the next slide, a painting that I call the Mona Lisa of London. You cannot come to London without seeing The Girl at a Window by Rembrandt. It is our star painting, painted in 1645, in the very middle, the high point of Rembrandt's career. And it shows a girl just leaning on a ledge, looking out towards us. And we believe in her as a real figure, the way that Rembrandt tricks us into thinking oil paint on canvas could be as real flesh and blood. She seems so, so very alive. Kim Wilkie looked at this painting and saw the detail, which we'll zoom in into on the next slide, of this, a sort of golden clasp that holds together her chemise. And that clasp is made up of a plaited shape. And Kim Wilkie was inspired by that plait and came up with this idea of plaiting the earth to create these new hills in our gardens. And so it is as if the painting itself comes alive. And that's it, art and nature together. You have to come and see it to understand what I'm talking about. The next slide shows a little glimpse of another artwork that we are going to be bringing to Dulwich Picture Gallery. And you might say, what am I talking about? This is a tree, and this is a tree in free sculpture last year. So this is Regent's Park. Well, in front of that tree, you can see the shape of a shadow. And you might think that this is a cleverly taken photograph that simply captures a shadow on a sunny day of this tree. But in fact, this is an artwork by the artist Albano Hernandez, who in June this year is going to be creating one of these tree shadows in our gardens. He selected a tree in the other part of our gardens because all of our gardens are turning into the sculpture garden, and he's going to be creating a tree shadow specially for us. And he describes his process. He says, I envisioned a piece that neither rises above the ground nor disrupts its surface. The shadow is an ephemeral and biodegradable work, so he paints it onto the grass. It's a work that leaves no trace, does not harm the grass, and does not disturb wildlife. It is a living painting, evolving and shifting with its environment. So Albano is going to come and create one of his tree shadows in Dulwich Picture Gallery, and it will last for a few weeks in our spaces, this ephemeral living painting, reflecting a shadow. So he paints a shadow as it truly forms, and then as the sun changes direction, the shadow remains. This will be alongside a work that we acquired for the gallery collection. Our next slide will show it, The Bronze Oak Grove by Rob and Nick Carter, which some of you might have seen in 2017 when it was first made. Its first location was Kensington Gardens. And that's where I first saw this work, and I couldn't believe my eyes. 9 tree stumps cast in bronze. They look so realistic that Sarah was reflecting earlier. It was as if birds thought they could make their nests in them, and insects might want to burrow into them. They look so much as if they are made out of wood, carved out of wood, or in fact are tree stumps themselves. They are so realistic. We have to go to our visitors and knock on them to show that they are made of bronze. But these are works. This is one work made up of 9 tree stumps, which we acquired for the collection just recently as the hero piece of our sculpture garden project. And the reason we wanted these works, well, this is an evocation of a 17th century drawing by a Dutch artist called Jacob de Heen. And this sketch originally captured just one side, a drawing just showing a tree stump. And what Rob and Nick did was to think of this in 3 dimensions and to create then a sculpture that is made up of a repetition of this form in 3D, a sculpture that can be played on, sat upon. It really feels part of the gardens and is very exciting. And so in a way, this dialogue continues. The artist that I mentioned, Jacob de Heen, well, his father was painted by Rembrandt, and we have a portrait of him in the collection. So what we have a vision of at the gallery is bouncing visitors between the historic paintings within the building and having links to the sculptures that they will discover in our gardens themselves. But let's just look at a couple of those paintings. Since I'm here representing Dulwich Picture Gallery, I think we should have a look at some paintings. And I thought a good example to look at would be a Dutch painting by the artist Adam Pijnacker. A landscape with sportsmen and game, a classic Dutch landscape, which captures that sensation of nature. You feel that you're outdoors with these this hunter, and you can see the animals. You can actually see a dog defecating in the center of the painting. You don't have a Dutch painting without the humor of a dog trying to go to the toilet right in the center of the painting. These artworks are intended to draw us in, to make us laugh, and then astonish us with their beauty. Pijnacker has captured, particularly in this painting, the way that trees can be like sculptures, like works of art that can just absolutely wow us with their beauty. Here in the left part of this painting, we see this silver birch. Originally, as part of Kim Wilkie's design for our meadow at the gallery, he wanted to plant silver birches. And I learned the hard way as we went through the planning application process that these days silver birches are a little bit of a problem because they can be linked with asthma. And so we didn't plant silver birches as part of our scheme in the gallery, but we do have this exquisite depiction of the tree with lichen attached to it. It's so particular. And in the very foreground, you can see some leaves that seem to be incorrectly painted blue. And the big mystery is whether originally Pijnacker had painted green on top of the blue, and then over time that fugitive layer of paint, maybe created in a glaze, might have, through the history of the painting, worn away so that you see the underlayer. Or was Pijnacker painting a cabbage leaf or a type of blue leaf? We welcomed at the gallery today a new member of staff, a gardener who's joining our team, who's absolutely wonderful and is immediately thinking of these questions and is going to help us to try and plant maybe some cabbage leaves or a plant that looks a little bit like this in our gardens. Again, just linking the inside and the outside. And I cannot talk about the paintings in the collection without mentioning the great Gainsborough. Thomas Gainsborough in the 18th century, one of the finest artists who ever lived, you'll see on the next slide, paints a couple in a landscape. In the 18th century, Gainsborough was celebrated as a portrait painter. People wanted him to paint their portraits because he was so good at capturing fashions and making things feel very current and alive. But for the purposes of tonight, let's ignore this couple. We don't actually know what they're called. Let's ignore them, although they do look very happy in their setting, very relaxed. Gainsborough's making sure that that he's conveying that this is a couple who feel very at one with their nature and with their environment. But between them, it's a bit of a triple portrait, because between them we have this oak tree, and then they are leaning against what Adam has told me is a chestnut fence made out of chestnut wood. And so actually trees are very important to the way that Gainsborough is painting. And anytime you look at a painting by Gainsborough, look particularly at the leaves that he depicts on trees in the background. Can you see the leaves of the trees in the background? He paints leaves as though you could hear the rustling of the air running through them. It's so beautifully done. And so this is a charming little painting, one of quite a few paintings by Gainsborough that we have in the collection, which directly reminds us of how trees can be taken very seriously indeed. I wonder if on this point I could turn to Emmeline. What do you make of the oak tree in this painting, Emmeline?
Well, quite. I think what's so important about trees in art today are how we would look at them in the 21st century and try and guess really what somebody in the 18th century would have thought of them. So it's quite a fun game to do, actually. What was the importance of that oak? Was it important because it was a British species of tree that was native, that you found it a lot on estates? Is it important in this context because it looks quite weathered and beaten and it's perhaps in the last stages of its life? Because the artist didn't really write about it, it is hard to know. But what we can assume is that their connection to nature was innate. So we have to try and get into that mindset. And one of the reasons why I set up the tree art gallery was almost because, to a certain extent, trees have become the foreground images, and they have actually in the art that we sell. We sell artworks that is inspired by trees or made out of wood. And we work with a fabulous group of artists, and we could represent thousands. There are lots of people who are so enthusiastic about art and wood, and it's fantastic. There's nothing more exciting than exploring our environment and the natural world, in my opinion, obviously. So from this picture, we can take the delicious oak tree and all the aspects that we can try and surmise, I suppose, about its importance in the setting. And if I take you next to the next slide, and this is also an oak tree, and this is a piece of contemporary art. It's made by a lovely artist called Effa Rowe, who's doing a PhD and just finishing it with an outstanding result on trees in art. And actually that's really, really unique. I don't know whether he's the first, but he's certainly one of the first. It's definitely a burgeoning field. And this oak tree here was planted at the same date as the Rembrandt picture, we can assume. It's about the same date. So if the girl at the window had planted an oak sapling with the Tree Council, this is the date that the tree would be now. And what Effa's done, and what he does in his work, is he explores how, instead of taking the oak tree as a subject that we appropriate to put into this artwork to then look at, by using aspects of the oak, from the tannin to the leaves to the soil and the bark, and mixing them as part of the pigments from which he makes these photo prints. They're called cyanotypes, and which echo with photosynthesis because they also develop with sunlight. He's incorporating the tree itself as part of the artwork. And what we then do at the Tree Art Gallery when we offer them for sale is we make a donation to the Tree Art Council in the hope that the artwork that's inspired by the tree, in the case of Effa's artwork that's made by the tree, and obviously paper is obviously a tree derivative, is then actually sponsoring the planting of a tree for future artists and generations. So there's this beautiful symbiotic relationship between art, its creativity and nature, and the artists that are the geniuses, really, the creative geniuses that the in between the visual and the living creature itself. What's so fascinating in just the 4 years that I've started this gallery is the burgeoning amount of exhibitions. 4 years ago, I don't think there was a single exhibition in London on trees, and I think I've counted 6 already this year in London, never mind probably 23 globally. So it is a really exciting time for trees to become centre and focus of contemporary art, and perhaps that's a reflection of the consciousness of art and the people that are going to create art and go and visit galleries. So a really exciting time. So this is Effa, fantastic young artist to watch, really super talented, a dream to work with. And then the next slide is again another fascinating artist. So this is an elm tree in Brighton, and again it could have been painted, it could have been planted by the girl at the window, because it was thought to be planted around 1613, and sadly, due to Dutch elm disease, which Adam can talk a lot better about than I can, 2 of the elm trees that were signature elm trees in Preston Park in Brighton started to die from Dutch elm disease, which took a lot of the elm trees out of the UK in the 21st century. So the remnants of these twin trees were disintegrating. As you can see, there's probably a fifth of the tree left here. And in 2020, the artist Elpida Hadis Vasileva, who's originally from Macedonia and based in the UK, and trained and studied art in the UK, decided to create the remnants of this particular elm tree into a memorial. I'm sure we've all seen memorials of figures of important, like the Albert statue outside the Albert Hall, where gold leaf is used in commemorative sculpture. Here we've got gold leaf on the elm tree itself, and it really is a very poignant reminder of the transience of nature, of trees. Again, Adam can touch on disease if he wants to later. Also, the fact that as an ecosystem, the world experiences diseases that create problems that can, especially in this day and age, travel around the world. So it's something that we're all conscious of. We've all been through the pandemic, anyone who was born before 2020. So there's a lot of connections. Again, this is contemporary art, taking trees as subject matter, the state that trees are in particular the elm tree in this one, and making sure that there's a way to commemorate, to have a dialogue with them as subjects. And there's another photograph there with the beautiful bluebells coming up. Adam's going to talk more about bluebells. But yeah, I think one of the things, the greatest gifts about working with trees and contemporary art is really how poignant, how moving, and how increasingly relevant and popular the dialogue and the conversation between nature, art, trees is. And it's a really exciting time. And we couldn't be more delighted to work with Sarah at the Tree Council. You know, when a sale does happen and we can make a donation and we can see trees being planted for the next generation and future generations of artists to be inspired and to work in the shade of. It does feel like we're continuing the long-standing tradition that Jennifer so expertly just relayed, that's been going on for years within art, and now it's centre and focus. So really, there's no one better to talk about trees and which species are being involved in the art and what their importance is for art than Adam, really. So over to you, the baton over to you, Adam.
Okay, thank you. So I've worked with trees for over 35 years, and I'm quite comfortable walking around a woodland and interpreting it and chatting to a group of people. But being asked to talk about trees in art was a bit outside my comfort zone. So I made, it was a lovely opportunity to think about a subject matter from a different angle. And that's quite unusual after 35 years of sort of managing trees. So I indulged myself with a generous allocation of time to procrastinate and started thinking about the ask in tonight's presentation. And these 3 little exercises I've written up there is what I found myself doing. So I visited a couple of galleries close to me, and I walked around those galleries as though I was in the countryside and made notes and talked in my head about what I would see. What was lovely, I started thinking about the term curating. And so I visited a bluebell wood probably about 10 times as the bluebells were coming into season. And I thought about that woodland as though it had been curated by somebody or something that had deliberately presented everything I was looking at as an experience in its own right. And I'd encourage people to have a walk in the countryside thinking that way. And then the other one is for somebody that wouldn't confess to being having a strong interest in art. I looked around my house, which is of course is dripping in art that's relating to trees and the countryside, and started to think about why did I choose that and what does it mean to me. So that would bring us into our first slide. Let's go to the next slide. So a real good sort of point whenever you're doing guided walks is to talk about the mythology of trees, and quite often I'll use the tree as a prop, but to bring our association with the trees alive, we talk about mythology. Now, the great thing about the galleries is that we've got the artist's representation of the mythology, and those links those 3 things together: the tree, the image, the mythology. So a few examples in the Dulwich picture gallery here I've put in there. We're just going to talk about the mythological creatures of the fauns or the satyrs. So the Romans would refer to them as fauns and the Greek satyrs, and then I'll go on to talk about nymphs. So the fauns were, it says that when you read it, talks about half goat, half human. To my mind, I wonder if they're half deer, half human, because deer are more associated with woodlands. But they're associated with the rustic god Faunus, who's the rustic god of the forest. And these are characters that love wine, dancing, music, and women. And the nymphs are the if you like, the spirits of nature, often portrayed as women. And then you've got a lovely painting of the bacchanal. I think that's it's pronounced. So bacchanal was like an informal party in the woodland where you would go and let your inhibitions run free, and there'd be wine and dancing and song. And I did wonder whether actually it's significant that these are represented in woodlands as a place away from society where you're almost anonymous, and it's easier to say let yourself inhibitions run free. And there's kind of a suggestion that woodlands are metaphorically and also literally quite a shady place. So that's the bacchanal there. We'll go on to the next slide, which is to talk about the nymphs. And so nymphs I mentioned were, if you like, the spirits of natural places. I was aware of the term naiads as the nymphs of watery places, or mythological spirits with watery places. That I'd heard the term dryads and read up about it, but dryads are the nymphs that are associated with woodlands and all trees, especially oak trees if you use the term dryads. But then individual trees have these mythological nymphs associated with them, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce a couple of those. But Psyche obviously probably lends its name to the word sycamore as well. Now the hamadryads, special nymphs, and this is significant in that it's where we start seeing in our psyche, in our culture, that there's something more about a tree than its purpose for ourselves. It's more important to us just than the products that we can either take from it or the timber we can gain from felling it. And I think everybody can relate to that. So I've just made a little reference to the sycamore gap. That's really probably the strongest example that we've got of where actually we can just see how important that tree is to everybody, even if you've never visited it, and why it's important. And I just had to sneak in the Lorax as well, which, if you know that book's about a little character that represents and speaks for the trees. I love the fact that the Lorax was a banned text in a couple of schools in an American state, where it was seen as anti-forestry industry and anti-entrepreneurship. And I love the subversive nature of challenging banned text. And I loved reading it to my boys for that reason as much as the story itself. But I saw direct links with those and the mythology of the nymphs and the dryads. So next slide. So here we go. Here's a particular story then of the nymph Daphne as she's fleeing. So Apollo took a liking to Daphne and pursued her, and as she was trying to escape Apollo, one of the stories I read, she was getting deeper entangled into the briars and scratched by the briars. So she called to her father, and he transformed her into a laurel tree or a bay tree to escape. And there's a lovely picture there. When if you look into it, and you can actually see Daphne's arms, she's in the process of being transformed into a laurel tree. Apollo went on to adorn himself with the laurels, and it's why we use like the laurel wreaths to celebrate a victory in like a sporting event, and laurel crowns as well. It's probably more likely to be bay trees as we know them, rather than a cherry laurel. Okay, it's a lovely story there. Okay, next slide. There we go. Yeah, so I'm going to mention two things that came from that one. One is the briars. And briars I could probably see as the underdogs of the arboreal world. We tend to overlook them, but we celebrate them. And I noticed I had these three pieces of art. So good old William Morris, that's my wife's yoga bag. And the picture of the shrubs in blossom is blackthorn whilst it's in blossom. And it's a deep entangled, I've worked with it, I've sort of restructured blackthorn sort of that's been overstood, and we managed to restructure the woodland. And nightingales return. They like to nest in it if it's not too leggy, not too tall and leggy. It's impossible, it's entangled, you can't pull it apart. It's got these deep thorns in them that can, puncture your skin, puncture your welly, so you have to wear thick gloves. I do wonder whether we talk about the folklore of the Sleeping Beauty and the roses growing up. I wonder if it was blackthorn. The ceiling rose above is one that we bought and put up, and again you can see that's got bramble and rose in it, so that's the briars there and the ceiling rose, and I love that design there. And then just the picture there of the September swallows, the foliage on the right, we've got hawthorn and bramble and ivy. Now that's representing the briars in autumn, which is the time of year that the swallows tend to gather and move to the east of England before migrating together. So lovely little representations of briars there. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so before we move on from mythology, I just wanted to mention another story with Apollo. So he had a relationship with an attractive Spartan prince called Hyacinth, and in a friendly game of discus, apparently the discus bounced, hit Hyacinth on the head, and he died. And Apollo was so remorseful, his tears fell, and where his tears fell, a mythical flower grew. Now, the hyacinth we know is named after the mythical flower, as opposed to hyacinths as we know them grew. The interesting thing for me, which I've always talked about, is on a bluebell wood, so a native traditional bluebell wood, the bluebells, their scientific name is Hyacinthoides non-scripta, which means a hyacinth-like flower without letters. And if we looked, I've used a picture of a Spanish bluebell there rather than a hyacinth. So you can see the difference in the flowers. And this is where you would be able to notice if it was a Spanish invasive bluebell or a native one. It's much more upright and the flowers are more open and more stylock. And it's said that the 6 petals are supposed to spell out the words A-I-A-I, which I've done as a representation in the middle, which spells out the words alas, which is the sign of grief, of Apollo's tears. And so we talk about the native bluebells as non-scripta, without letters. Okay, so next one. So that's brought me onto talking about bluebell woodlands. So these bluebells are probably to my mind, one of the best wildlife spectacles that we've got in the UK, the specialism of Southeast England. And whilst it takes a couple of weeks for them to go through the full show of bluebells, if you get the peak day, it's just absolutely magical to be in a bluebell woodland. And these are ancient woodlands. These are the last of our primordial soils. They're rich in seed banks of unusual plants, and they're just absolute wonderful places to be. I've always known that the bluebell bulbs are quite starchy, and that was used for glues for things like bookbinding and Fletcher's arrows, but it was also used as the starch for Elizabethan collars. And there's a Elizabethan collar there in that picture, worthy of the starch worthy to set a collar like that. It's just quite phenomenal. And then a little deviation now from talking about trees, but I had to mention it, is the picture of King John there with the fur-lined collar. Now that fur is known as ermine, which is the name we give to stoats in the winter when they turn to white in the snowy areas in the north of England. And the tips of their tails are black, so the black dots in the fur collars are the tails of the stoats. So you've got another portrait of a baron. He's got hardly any black dots in his cape, and I wonder it's because he's not got quite the status to afford quite so many stoats in his ermine collar. But I couldn't help but notice that, and it would be something you'd talk about as the ermine cloth if you're out on a guided walk. Okay, should we move on then? Okay, so we're still sticking with the ancient woodlands, and these are woodlands that have been wooded since at least 1600, so at least 400 years, which means they've been wooded continuously prior to then. But these have been managed. We still produce products from them, and in managing them, we keep sort of a dynamic equilibrium of habitats going. So I've spent a lot of time managing coppice woodlands. The 2 main species are hazel and chestnut. And so the chestnut, it's used, it's known as poor man's oak. So it splits, it cleaves readily. So it doesn't quite have the same structural integrity as oak, but it's got the tannins in, so it doesn't rot in the ground. So it was used quite a lot in fencing rather than in buildings. So I've got a couple of pictures there of cleft chestnut. So the larger stem stuff, you'd cleave it down into sort of 6 or so segments, and then you'd install it, the mortise and tenon joints in the ground. And when I trained to fell chestnut and make this fencing and install them, we were told to put it with the heartwood facing upwards so that it shed water, it was more resistant to rot, and as it just bowed slightly as it seasoned, it would tighten in the sockets rather than fall out. And what was lovely about the Gainsborough is the attention to detail. And as much as I have to comment every time I see chestnut fencing in the landscape, I have to comment on whether it's been put in upside down or the right way up, much to my poor long-suffering family. I just had to zoom in on the Gainsborough picture there, and it looks to me as though they're leaning on the chestnut cleft mortise and tenon chestnut fencing, and the way the shadows are on the rails, it looks to me as though it's been honed down with an adze or a draw knife, and Gainsborough's painted his fencing the right way up, much to my satisfaction. So that's the sort of thing I noticed when I'm walking around a gallery, and absolute delight in it. Okay, should we go on to the next slide? Okay, so still talking about less away from the vernacular landscapes, the landscape that's been made as a product of the local materials. But in this central picture here of the ducks on the pond, the ducks themselves and the vegetation looks a little bit naive to me. But the thing, and it's difficult to identify the vegetation, and the fencing's a little bit rough. But what was lovely to see is on the left-hand side, there's a tree that's, you can see the stems stops, and then it's been pollarded, so it's been cut repeatedly or cyclically at a height above sort of grazing cattle, and then the stems that grow are quite thin, and those that have been harvested every year or two, and that's where we get the withies from that we use for weaving baskets. So there's so many paintings you see with woven baskets within it, and obviously it was a material that had been used for household objects. So there's just a couple there that I've put in as well. One of the first I did one of my first, well, actually the first time I got involved with doing working with the media was about pollarding willows. So that's got a very fond memories. I've got a nostalgia working with willow pollarding. So if we move on to the next slide. So this, I've just put this in here. So I've got a lot of wicker in our house, and we kind of like it, and it's there intuitively, but it got me thinking about the differences between these items. So the chair in the background and the laundry basket in front of the tack are just literally the items that we have, but we prefer those to plastic chairs just because they're nice and they're tactile. I did wonder whether the plant pot was done in the style of wicker, but the other three items, there's a deeper meaning into those for me. So the basket in the front with the really sort of uneven sides and the slightly crooked wailing, that's the sort of the bonding on the top, is a basket that I made myself when I went on a little basket weaving course. And so that basket's got a huge amount of sort of sentimental importance to me and nostalgia. And we'll still use it as a basket, but it means so much more to me than the sort of utilitarian use of it. The willows at the back there, the sticks is what you'd weave the basket out of, and that's kept as objet d'art. And then the little basket is on the windowsill is just so beautifully made that we just admired it in a shop and had to buy it, and it sits on the windowsill rather than getting used. So that got me thinking about what is it that we value about art, and there is something about it having sentimental reasons. So it could be nostalgia, or it could be sort of memories that there. And an objet d'art is something that's not conceived to be an artistic object, but we value it as such. Yeah, so that's a little sculpture to us. Okay, so move on to the next one. Okay, so before we move on from that picture there of the infant with Christ bearing the instruments of passion, the other item that I had to notice was the crucifix, and there are probably as many crucifixes in the Dulwich Picture Gallery collection as there are baskets and wickerwork. And I was always told whenever we meet a tree called aspen, which I actually found a really lovely stand of them today, I have to talk about the crucifix. So aspen is a fast-growing tree in wet areas, so it's not got a lot of strength to the timber. And part of the way it resists being blown over is the stalks on the leaves are flat, which means when the wind goes through it, it can pass through really quickly, and they quiver and they shake. So it's known as the quivering poplar. And the Latin name there is Poplus tremula, so the trembling poplar. And it's said in folklore that the Christ's cross was made out of aspen wood, which is why it is quaking and quivering with the fear of the crucifixion. I wonder actually if it was a single-use product, a single-use item. It's a funny way of thinking about the crucifix rather than what it represents. Aspen wood would probably be quite appropriate because it's not long-lived and it's light and it's not very durable, and it would have been easier to have carried. If so, I'd love to see a crucifix represented as round wood and not milled, because that, to my mind, would be a more appropriate way for it to have been constructed. And then, without going too much on it, the carts on the right-hand side that you see in all the paintings are constructed from different types of wood. So the hubs of the wheels would be made from elm, and the spokes would be made from ash, and the fellies, which are the parts on the outside, would be made from oak. And there's some lovely, drew me to some literature as well. And there's a lovely book on the Real Rights Workshop that describe the trees in the landscape and the going out to source the timber from the trees in the landscape, purchasing them, negotiating with the farmer in order to make the parts needed. And we see the landscape in the oil paintings that I've read about in books like Trees and Woodlands of the British Landscape. So, typically things like the elms and the oaks within the hedgerows. So just what I'd mention that one there. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so the poplar, drew my eye to the poplar we talked about beforehand. And this one, I noticed, so Walton Bridge leapt out at me, partly because of that. I mean, the woodwork, you can't help not to notice that painting. Walton Bridge I know very well. I grew up nearby and I must have cycled under it and over it hundreds of times. So I got on the Google Express and went and looked in Google Maps to see what the landscape's looking like now and compared it to Canaletto. And delighted to see that there were lots of riparian trees, so trees that grow alongside the water are still there. Some of the artists you look at, they seem to have learned to paint a genetic dark green tree or a genetic sort of paler green tree. And I caught a programme on Radio 4, and he was an art forger who's now, his works are valued in their own right, and he does kind of reproductions arts. But his view was Canaletto was the absolute master. He was the ones that he found the most challenging but the most enjoyable to paint. And I have to say that oak tree on the right-hand side of the bridge, I think of all the pictures of the trees, the way he's captured that oak foliage and just the sort of the general impression of oak, that absolutely stood out to me as probably the most accomplished tour I saw and the most difficult aspect to capture that character of the oak. But both in the photograph from Google and in the painting, we can see on the horizon a very tall trees poking up, and those poplars. They look like it's a slightly different species of poplars, but again, these tall growing, fast growing trees next to water. And those ones reminded me of a painting that we've got at home of the Malvern Hills, which we bought when we got married, and that's where we went for a walk. And in there you can see there's the poplars represented on the right-hand side with lots of mistletoes in them. And I've just put a little photograph in there of some poplars with mistletoes on the top as well. So, okay, next slide. So back to the Gainsborough, we've talked about the chestnut fencing. I had to have a big shout out for veteran trees, as we now call them. I don't know that Gainsborough would have called them as veteran trees. It would have been an old oak that's long past its use for timber. And a lot of these veteran trees that have survived were pollarded, so they would have been cut above grazing height and the timber taken away every 20 or 30 years. And that allowed the main stem to survive in some cases for 500, 600, 700 years, anything up to about 1,000 years. And Gainsborough's, he's another one that his ability to paint that old oak tree, the detail he's got in there, the colours, the pale bleaching of the sound wood, and then the sort of the reddy colour of the decaying heartwood is just fantastic. And I've just put a picture in there just of one of the oak trees I know down the road, and you can see how you've got that same colour in it there. A lot of the artists don't put those in, but where they put them in, it brings the pictures to life. So I think the next slide, we've got a few different veteran trees in there. So you can see, yeah, the three pictures on the outside. You can see what it adds to the paintings are fantastic. It adds a lot of character and depth and diversity. It means that it's not just a backdrop in order to put their subject matter that's often a human in there. Because there's a number on there. I was going to go to the one on the far right. It looks quite like an ash tree to me. And sadly we're losing our ash trees at the moment. We've got ash dieback. Possibly we may lose 70% or more of our ash trees. And it's difficult for people working in the tree industry to see them go and disappear. The one thing which reminds us and really adds that was really heartening is that I'm just old enough to remember losing the elm trees from the landscape. So elms are incredibly valuable trees, a very tough, durable timber with the grain that interlocks. So these were prized and valued and grown within the boundary hedges of farms, because it was a way you could have a sort of a long-term investment. We've lost all of those, and we've lost that landscape, and we can only see them in these paintings still. That's now happening to the ash trees, and it's difficult to know what to do. But the great hope is now that we are able to buy Dutch elm disease resistant elm varieties, and I've planted some when I've been managing sites in the past, and last year, having moved to Norfolk, there's elms are still hanging on here, and I bought 100 of these elms and planted them out in the hedgerows in North Norfolk. And there's a quite a rarish butterfly called the white letter hairstreak that's dependent on them, so we can now restore the landscapes, get the trees back in the landscape, and support the white letter hairstreaks. And it brings us back to seeing them in the pictures. A photograph of just a really nice big pollard at Cork Abbey, because I happened to be there. I think the protective fencing around it is cleft chestnut, and then just a picture there of the Enfield oak, just as a big shout out to say that we've been campaigning to get better protection for these trees. And sadly, the Enfield oak highlighted the need for their protection yet again. But it'd be lovely to see something change so that they're automatically protected and don't need to have a proactive TPO put on them. Okay, so there's veteran trees. We had to mention the veterans, didn't we? Okay, next one. Okay, so slight deviation again here, but it caught my eye. It wasn't a tree in the landscape, but this picture of the stork on the picture on the left. So piety. I picked up the text piety on a sculpture in the countryside a few weeks ago, walking the Pedder's Way, and looked it up. So I noticed that, and I didn't recognise the bird as a heron or an egret. So I thought it's got to be a stork. And then so I looked up what's the connection with storks and piety. So piety is a value, and it's a value of living in accordance with sort of our religious values, in particular loyalty and fidelity. Now this comes from the stork's behaviour, which is it pairs for life, and it returns to the same tree to nest every life. So it's seen as a bird that understands loyalty and fidelity, which is where we get the folklore of storks delivering babies. And that one just struck a little chord to me. And again, a little bit of a loose connection here is the virtue represented there of liberality. When you hone in on those pictures, the two, they look like sort of horns that are used as vessels to carry things, and they're pouring out two different opposing values. So liberality is having a liberal mind to understand opposing views. And what was interesting is the way that's been represented in the right hand horn. If you it's wealth. So there's money and objects that would be highly expensive to purchase. So things like silver cutlery in there and other bits and bobs. Whereas on the other side, it seems to be the natural world, or items that represent the natural world are coming out, as though the two things are polarized values. Which probably still runs true today, isn't it? Is do we value the natural world as much as we value material wealth? So there, and then this brings me in. The reason the next slide comes in is there's a picture I've got of. So that's my house there on the left. There's our red tile roof, and behind it is a woodland, and it's home as a rookery. So we get in the autumn, I estimate a couple of thousand rooks and jackdaws come in and roost in the autumn, and in the evening, if I was to open the window, you'd hear them all turn up at rook o'clock every evening as they all fly in. The expression as straight as the crow flies is actually the rooks returning from the fields to their rookeries. And rooks pair for life. So in the spring, when the trees are still not in leaf, you see these little silhouetted pairs of rooks sitting in the trees. And so the other picture we've got on the right there is the trees look a little bit more like baobab trees, but I recognise them as an artistic representation of beech trees. But you've got the rooks flying into the rookery with a red tiled roof in the background and a couple walking down the road together. So that's a tree that's it's just what it contains and what that personal composition means to us as much as anything else. Okay, so I think we're getting close to the end of my slides now. Yeah, go a couple more then. I think I've got 3 more slides to go. So very easy to overlook this picture because it's quite dark. And I think the artist did it deliberately dark, because what it really allows to do is to notice where he's put the light. So the light's coming down through the trees, and to see the subject matter, it looks like a sort of couple of people and a dog there. But if you zoom in and look closely, the way that he's allowed the light to catch the ivy growing up. I'd love to think it was an elm tree that it was growing up. Shakespeare talks about ivy growing on elm trees as a representation of humans, and it looks like some sort of spindly ash coming up there. But the way in which that draws you in and to catch that light really, really seemed to sort of notice it. And we had to think about light in art, and with trees in particular and woodlands, of all the habitats and landscapes we experience, it's three-dimensional. It towers above us. If we think about meadows and heathland and, you know, and even coastal areas and even hills, you don't immerse yourself in them in quite the same way as you do with trees. So the study of light, I think, in trees and art is really quite exceptional. So that's my next one. So just in order to think about light and how we see it. So think about stained glass windows, and they're stained glass windows. Yes, it's the subject matter and it looks like they're illuminated, but it's also the way the light passes through the stained glass and what it does to the inside of churches or buildings, and to have that light around us in the room. And then I've just put a couple of pictures in there. So although that's a picture of a tawny owl, and the tawny owl's a bit naive, a little bit two-dimensional, but the way in which it's captured the sycamore leaves, and you can see the layer upon layer of the silhouettes of the leaves above it as the light's tried to penetrate the forest canopy, create that sort of dappling effect. I thought John Tennant's created that exceptionally well, and just makes you feel as though you're in a woodland with the light trying to come through that dappled sycamore. Okay, so we'll just go through to the last slide now. There we go. So this is the last slide. I was going to start my presentation with a definition for art, but it just sort of brought this the whole sort of talk between us together by putting that definition at the end. And there's several there, but it was something about creativity and beautiful or meaningful. And we don't need to make trees beautiful or meaningful. They are beautiful and they are meaningful. But I think where we use trees in art, it's that creative way of looking at or using trees, looking at all these different reference points about their sort of visual, the cultural, what it means to us personally. And nothing better, this forest that we've created at the gallery on the sculpture meadow, planting these, the trees that we've planted, by the way, are wild service trees. Their name comes from, it's an aberration of the Spanish word cerveza, meaning beer, and the fruits from them were used to flavour beer, and it's where, and that was known as Checkers. And so if you see pubs called the Checkers, it's actually with reference to the drink made out of. So we've created a beer garden, just to use a slightly mischievous term for it. But what's amazing about this place, and it's already happened, is that the picture there of the leaf is actually a piece of jewellery that I got commissioned for my wife a few years ago of a wild service leaf. And the reason I did it was because it's just a very unusual leaf and it's interesting, and the fruit allowed it to counterbalance. So it had personal meaning for me already. So then to be asked to come and plant this tree, that just puts that link in. It's got personal meaning. And if we think about it, this place it already has and will increasingly become a place that's important to people. So it will be a place for nostalgia and memories. We'll have children's memories will be anchored or rooted in growing up and playing in this place. It's a place in which sculpture can be displayed, but actually it's landscape art in its own right as a gallery. And if you walk around like the Natural History Museum or the Oxford Museum of Natural History, the building itself is full of artwork. It's constructed of things that have got the decoration that we see on, the William Morris. Everything in our house is decorated with William Morris, but we also see these natural history museums decorated with references to natural history. But I just think this is going to become a special place because we have created this special place with trees that are both beautiful and meaningful, and it's a celebration of them for that reason, as something that's just more with our culture and our psyche than being just a living plant in its own right. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Thank you, all our panelists. We've had purple leaves and golden trees and croissant and thorny briars. It's just been a fantastic insight into your different worlds. There are some questions, and I know that Emmeline, you have to shoot off promptly to another engagement. So the first question, I'm not sure, says you, and I can't remember who mentioned this, but somebody mentioned doing a PhD on trees in art. Will this be available to read anywhere at any point? I can't remember. Was that you, Jennifer, who mentioned that, or no?
I
Emily?
mentioned the PhD by Effa Rowe, and I'm if you drop me an email through the Tree Art Gallery, I can forward it to him. And yeah, we can find out a way that you can either read a synopsis of it or the actual work itself, and what he's going to do in order to publish it. So I can give you a lot more information on that if you drop us if you go onto the Tree Art Gallery website, just click on contact, I'll get it. And yeah. And
Just one.
we have it, sorry, Sarah, we also have a newsletter so we can update you on things like that, anything art and trees as well. So do keep an eye out for any more publications and books. All of our artists are always on exhibition or part of publication, so it's really exciting to keep you posted. But yeah, do get in touch with us.
Brilliant. And then is the gilded elm, Andrea asks, is the gilded elm painted as well as having gold leaf applied? It's so cool.
Yeah, yes, it's got that black paint layer on it, and it's all to protect it. So in a sense, it's fantastic the way it touches on Jennifer's trees in art and also Adam's artworks, because again, it is the artwork itself. The tree is the artwork, and then the black and the gold, and also you saw the pieces of metal really emphasize how it's become, instead of a sort of remnant of an elm tree, it really has become a memorial and a work of art in itself. But it's yeah, it's got materials on it which created into an artwork but also protected. And one of the things that Alpida is doing is fundraising for a legacy project that can protect it as an artwork and make sure that it's restored each, every 10 years, etc., etc. So maintaining the trees and maintaining the trees as artworks is also yeah, just part of the culture of trees in art, and art, trees being art. So yeah.
That's fantastic. I know that you have to go, so please don't feel that you need to stay. I don't want you to be late for your next engagement. If others are happy just to stay for another few minutes, there are just a couple or so more questions that Barbara's asked whether there's a recording of the presentation, and there is, and it will be available in sort of 24 hours or so. So that's a friend of the gallery, Jennifer, who has asked that. So we will make sure that that's circulated. And then Nicola says, what a wonderful event, such positivity and passion, thank you, which is lovely. Could the panel talk about whether they think trees occupy a special place in the history of British art? I'm thinking about the role of trees in historic shipbuilding and also the work of John Constable. And I'm just going to share, actually, whilst we're here, there's another book on art which I have always loved, which is this one here, which is called, it's very difficult to show, Trees in Art.
Trees in Art.
Yeah, by Charles Watkins, which is another book worth exploring. But panel, what do you think? Do you, Jennifer, do you think trees have always occupied a special place in the history of British art?
I think so, yeah, and so many. If you think back to medieval and early Renaissance paintings in Britain, they are painted on wood. So many. They actually are the foundation of paintings as well. But yeah, I think symbolically, and there's something so hopeful and yet wistful about a tree, and it's so strong and yet so delicate all at once. I think when Adam was talking about the Enfield oak, I actually quickly looked that up because I didn't know enough about that story, and the heartache of something that seems so noble and strong has been there for 500 years, then just being in a second just being cut down. I think there's a really emotional connection to that, and you see artists definitely using trees as an anchor when they're painting portraits in landscapes. The tree anchors the figures and sort of is that connector between people and place. But also just paintings of trees on their own. If anybody's ever looked at the paintings of Mondrian, if you look back to actually the beginnings of Mondrian's, what we think of as quite abstract forms, started from trees. So in art in general, I think it's very important. Of course, Mondrian is Dutch, and you see in Dutch tradition, trees are so very important as well. But specifically in British art, I think there's something that I think we identify in this country with trees, and it's sort of being really indicative of the way the countryside feels, and then the shadows and light dappling through trees. I mean, it's a dream for artists, and can be so very poetic.
I would echo that. And on the Constable front, if you go through books by Graham Reynolds on constables and artwork, there are so many willows by the banks of the Stour, elm trees. It's almost as if trees were his way of sort of relaxing before he painted a bigger composition. And again, like Jennifer was saying, and trees are integral to the environment of artists. A lot of the time they walked everywhere. They didn't have cars, they didn't have steam trains. So there was no way that you couldn't have a really good look at a tree, because you were either waiting for a carriage or you're walking past one. So again, it's that understanding almost that until steam and engines, nature and our closeness and our interaction with nature, especially if you were an artist, but if you were just everybody, would have been so much more intimate than we're used to today as we shut the doors or walk on concrete. So it's also a reminder of that the connection that we're almost all yearning for by having art on our walls that is of trees, and by looking at art by earlier artists which has got trees in it, is all part of that connection, and perhaps even a yearning to get back to nature and closer to nature again. I'm going off on a tangent, but
oh no, I can hear the emotion and the
yeah.
kind of connections in your voice. Sadly, we have come to a time when we need to finish, but we have put lots of links in the chat. Thanks to the Urban Tree Festival. Please go visit the Dulwich Picture Gallery. It is an awesome place, both inside and outside. And please drop into Emmeline's Tree Art Gallery online. The link is there. It's a real cornucopia of different art to enjoy and to buy there. And I wanted also, just before we go, to give a plug to the Tree Council's latest publication, by Princeton University Press, which is with our very own John Stokes, who's been with the Tree Council for 35 years. And it's an absolutely fantastic guide to the trees of Britain and Ireland. And we have a special discount as part of the Urban Tree Festival. So if you go to the link that we're putting in the chat and you put in the code, capital letters TRE25, then you will have a nice discount on the book. And that's available, the discount, until the 30th of June only. But again, a wonderful book. So thank you, panelists. Thank you to Kaylee and Maria, who've been doing all the tech behind the scenes and helping bring everybody together. Thank you to you who've spent the time with us. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for caring for the trees. You're awesome. So see you again soon. Many thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.